At 21:40, the night corridor outside Princess Charlotte's study should have been completely empty. Royal Guard Daniel Mercer slowed his steps when the biometric panel beside the study door flashed a silent warning icon. The indicator showed the room was still occupied, yet the interior motion sensor reported no movement for over 4 minutes. Mercer tapped the security console on the wall and opened the corridor log. The last record showed no exit, no escort authorization, and no door activity since the tutor had left. According to the system, the princess had never stepped into the hallway. Mercer looked down the perfectly quiet corridor again, then back at the study door. The problem wasn't the silence in the hall. The problem was that the security system insisted someone was still inside the room he had already found empty.
The private study corridor inside the Palace Education Wing was designed to remain quiet during afternoon hours, but it was never meant to be completely empty. Royal Guard Daniel Mercer stood at his assigned post beside the study door, his red ceremonial uniform sharply pressed beneath the soft glow of recessed ceiling lights. The corridor was equipped with modern palace security infrastructure, discrete biometric door panels, motion sensors hidden along the ceiling trim, and silent smart cameras positioned every 15 meters. Every movement inside this section of the palace was normally logged, tracked, and monitored in real time by the Central Protection Control Room 2 floors below. Mercer's responsibility was simple: maintain physical oversight of the study entrance while Princess Charlotte completed her scheduled digital tutoring session. The tutor had left exactly 8 minutes earlier, carrying a slim tablet device and confirming the end of the lesson with a brief nod to Mercer before walking down the hall toward the staff exit. According to the palace schedule system, the princess was still inside the study, finishing an educational program on her own tablet. That was normal. The palace encouraged short periods of independent learning after formal tutoring. Still, Mercer's attention remained fixed on the closed study door. In most cases, the princess would emerge within 2 or 3 minutes after the tutor left, often carrying her tablet or speaking briefly with the guard before returning to the family wing. Today, however, the corridor remained unusually still. Mercer shifted his gaze slightly toward the small digital indicator beside the doorframe. The biometric door lock panel displayed green, confirming the room remained unlocked and occupied according to the system. Inside the palace network, occupancy status was automatically updated whenever someone exited through the door sensor. If Princess Charlotte had stepped into the corridor, the system would already show the room as cleared. Yet the indicator still read occupant present. Mercer listened carefully. The thick walls of the palace normally carried faint interior sounds: chair movement, footsteps, the soft tap of fingers against a tablet screen. But now the study remained completely silent. Not the quiet of someone concentrating, the deeper stillness of a room without movement. Mercer allowed another minute to pass. Guards were trained to avoid unnecessary interruptions, especially during royal family activities. But procedure also required visual confirmation if a protected occupant failed to appear within a reasonable window after a scheduled session. Mercer stepped forward and placed his hand lightly on the study door handle. His movements remained controlled and professional, the quiet discipline of years of training guiding every motion. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The study lights were on. A tablet device rested on the desk, its screen now dark except for a faint standby glow. Mercer approached the desk and tapped the screen once to wake it. The device unlocked automatically through its internal identity recognition system, displaying the final page of the lesson program she had been using. The timestamp showed the session had ended 9 minutes earlier. Mercer looked down at the chair again. It was positioned slightly away from the desk, as if someone had stood up quickly rather than slowly pushing it back into place. A subtle detail, but guards were trained to notice those things. He moved toward the windows next. Both were closed and sealed with internal smart locks connected to the palace security network. Mercer checked the lock indicators. No recent opening activity registered. He turned slowly and scanned the rest of the room again. Everything remained in perfect order, almost too perfect. Children rarely leave a room this neatly after finishing an activity. A stylus normally rolled somewhere on the desk. A tablet remained active with a partially open application. Here, the device had gone idle, as if it had simply been abandoned mid-use. Mercer stepped back into the corridor and closed the study door again. The hallway lights cast long reflections across the polished floor panels, and the ceiling cameras remained quietly active above him. He walked toward the nearby wall console used for quick internal system checks. The touchscreen activated as soon as his identification badge came within range. Mercer opened the corridor movement log and reviewed the last 15 minutes of entries. The tutor's exit appeared exactly where expected. Corridor clear. Study room status occupied. Princess Charlotte inside. Mercer read the line twice. The system continued updating in real time, still showing the princess inside the study. Mercer slowly looked back toward the closed door at the end of the corridor. Inside Royal Protection Operations, when physical observation contradicted the digital record, one of them had to be wrong. And inside a palace security network designed with multiple verification layers, the digital record was rarely the one that failed. Mercer's gaze moved toward the ceiling camera watching the corridor. If the princess had left the study, the camera would have recorded it, but the system logs insisted she had never stepped into the hall. Mercer remained still for a moment longer, listening to the quiet building around him. Somewhere between the study room and the security network, something in the palace record was not telling the truth.
Daniel Mercer remained standing in the corridor for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the camera dome mounted near the ceiling above the study entrance. Inside the palace protection network, every corridor camera transmitted continuously to the central monitoring system, creating a layered digital record of movement that guards relied on with near absolute confidence. If Princess Charlotte had stepped into the hall, even briefly, the system would have registered motion, facial recognition confirmation, and corridor movement logs within seconds. Mercer turned back to the wall console and opened the archived camera feed for the last 20 minutes. The system responded immediately, displaying the corridor footage in a clean digital timeline. He scrolled back to the moment the tutor exited the study. The recording showed the tutor stepping into the corridor exactly as Mercer remembered, carrying her tablet and offering a polite nod before walking toward the administrative wing. The corridor remained quiet afterward. The study door closed. The lights above the hallway reflected gently across the polished floor. Mercer watched carefully as the footage continued. Nothing moved for several minutes. Then the timeline shifted forward. At first, the transition was almost invisible, the kind of subtle digital jump that could easily escape casual attention. But Mercer noticed the time indicator immediately. The recording had skipped ahead by 3 minutes. He leaned slightly closer to the screen. The corridor looked exactly the same in the resumed footage. Same lighting, same empty hallway, same closed study door. But the timestamp in the corner had advanced. Mercer replayed the sequence again. The same result appeared, a clean jump of exactly 3 minutes. No distortion, no visible glitch, just missing time. Inside the palace system, any interruption in recording normally triggered an automatic alert. The monitoring software was built with redundant verification layers precisely to prevent unnoticed gaps in surveillance. Yet the system displayed no warning messages. According to the security network, the camera had been recording continuously. Mercer opened the camera diagnostics panel. Status, operational. Recording integrity, confirmed. No system fault detected. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose, the quiet tension in his chest sharpening into focused awareness. 3 minutes was not a random number. In security movement terms, it was enough time for someone to enter a room, escort a person down the corridor, and disappear through a secondary passage before the next guard rotation even noticed the movement. Mercer shifted the console display to another data panel and opened the internal escort authorization log. Every authorized relocation of a royal family member required digital clearance issued by a senior security officer. The system began displaying entries connected to the same time frame. Mercer scanned the list calmly until one record stopped his attention. Escort authorization issued. Internal relocation. Clearance level, Senior Command. Subject, Princess Charlotte. The timestamp matched the exact 3 minutes missing from the camera footage. Mercer studied the authorization record carefully, his posture remaining composed, though the implications of the entry were immediately clear. According to the system, Princess Charlotte had not disappeared at all. She had been officially escorted away during the same 3-minute window that had vanished from the camera recording. The authorization showed a command-level clearance code issued through the credentials of a senior palace security officer. Mercer opened the detailed record. The name attached to the authorization appeared on the screen. Senior Security Officer Adrian Halstead. Mercer recognized the name instantly. Halstead was not simply another officer inside the protection unit. He held one of the highest operational positions within palace internal security, responsible for authorizing sensitive movements and security adjustments across the royal residence. An escort order issued under Halstead's credentials carried complete authority inside the protection system. Mercer leaned back slightly from the console. If Halstead had authorized the princess's relocation, the system had technically followed protocol. Senior Command occasionally ordered discreet movements of royal family members during internal security evaluations or precautionary relocations. Guards assigned to specific corridors were not always informed immediately of those decisions. Yet one element still refused to align with the explanation. If an escort team had entered the study and escorted the princess out, the corridor camera should have recorded the movement. At minimum, 2 individuals would have appeared in the footage, the escorting officer and the princess herself. But the camera showed an empty corridor before and after the missing 3 minutes. Mercer replayed the footage again, slowing the playback frame by frame around the gap. Nothing appeared. No shadow movement, no figure crossing the hall, just the quiet corridor continuing as if time itself had briefly paused. Mercer returned to the escort authorization screen. The system log included a routing reference indicating the princess had been moved through an internal access corridor rather than the public hallway Mercer was guarding. That detail explained why Mercer himself had not seen the relocation take place. The palace contained multiple internal passages used for security and staff movement. Still, those routes were monitored by their own access sensors. Mercer opened the adjacent door access log connected to the internal corridor network. Several entries appeared instantly. Most were routine staff movements earlier in the afternoon, but one entry stood out clearly. Service corridor access, opened. Duration, 2 minutes 47 seconds. Timestamp, exactly within the 3-minute camera gap. Mercer remained silent for a moment, reading the entry again. The authorization, the missing camera minutes, the service corridor access, all of it connected precisely within the same narrow window of time. The system presented the movement as legitimate, an escort authorized by senior command, but Mercer understood the deeper concern immediately. Royal protection procedures never relocated a royal child through service corridors without notifying nearby guard positions, and no such notification had reached him.
Daniel Mercer stepped away from the corridor console and allowed the screen to return to its idle display,
the faint reflection of the hallway lights fading across the dark glass. The palace security network had given him an explanation, an escort authorization under senior command credentials, but the structure of the movement itself did not match the normal patterns Mercer had seen during years of service. Royal family relocations were carefully coordinated. Even when discretion was required, nearby guards were usually informed at least moments before the movement occurred. In this case, the system log showed that Princess Charlotte had been moved through an internal service corridor without any notice reaching the guard stationed directly outside her study. Mercer turned toward the narrow side passage branching off the main hallway. This corridor was rarely used by visitors or royal staff. It connected the educational wing to a network of internal transit routes designed for maintenance teams and security personnel who needed to move through the palace without crossing public areas. The lighting here was softer and more functional, with thin LED strips running along the ceiling edges rather than the decorative chandeliers used in the main halls. Mercer walked slowly into the passage, his attention shifting automatically into patrol mode. The floor panels beneath his boots were smooth and clean, reflecting the pale white lights above. Motion sensors along the ceiling activated as he moved deeper into the corridor, brightening the path ahead of him in quiet increments. The palace remained silent around him, the thick stone walls absorbing most outside sound. After several meters, the corridor curved slightly toward a secondary exit used for staff deliveries and internal security movement. Mercer slowed as he approached the corner. Something small and metallic rested near the base of the wall just before the exit door. He crouched slightly and picked it up. It was a slim, palace-issued digital wristband. Mercer recognized it immediately. Members of the royal household often wore these lightweight devices during certain activities. The wristbands allowed the palace security network to track location within protected zones and monitor biometric signals such as heart rate and movement. Princess Charlotte occasionally wore one during lessons so staff could monitor her location inside the palace grounds. Mercer turned the band over in his hand. The screen was still active, though dim. The device displayed a connection signal searching for the palace tracking network. Mercer knew exactly what that meant. The wristband had been removed from its wearer. He lifted his eyes toward the nearby service exit door. The digital access panel beside it glowed softly, waiting for identification input. Mercer stepped closer and activated the access log through the panel interface. The system responded instantly. Door status, secure. Last opening, 2 minutes 47 seconds. Timestamp, the same 3-minute window that had vanished from the camera recording in the main corridor. Mercer studied the access log for a moment longer before stepping back slightly from the door. The service exit remained sealed now, its reinforced frame locked tightly against the outer courtyard beyond. According to the system record, the door had been opened and closed entirely within the same 3-minute gap that had disappeared from the camera recording in the main corridor. Mercer slipped the digital wristband carefully into his pocket and opened the door just enough to look outside. Cool evening air moved gently through the narrow gap. Beyond the threshold lay a small internal service courtyard enclosed by high palace walls. The stone ground was still damp from a light rain earlier in the afternoon, the surface reflecting faint yellow light from a pair of mounted security lamps. Mercer stepped outside briefly and scanned the courtyard. Near the far wall, faint tire marks curved across the wet stone, partially faded but still visible beneath the lights. A vehicle had entered the courtyard recently and left again. He returned inside and closed the door, the lock engaging with a quiet metallic click. The pattern was becoming clear now. Someone had used the missing 3 minutes in the camera recording to escort Princess Charlotte through this service corridor and out into the courtyard where a vehicle had been waiting. Yet the authorization attached to the movement belonged to Senior Security Officer Adrian Halstead. Mercer began walking back toward the main corridor, the quiet echo of his steps following him through the narrow passage. Inside palace protection operations, accusing a senior officer of misconduct required absolute proof.
Guards were trained to respect the chain of command and avoid making assumptions based on incomplete information. Still, Mercer could not ignore the central problem now forming in the evidence he had uncovered. If the princess had been relocated as part of an authorized operation, the movement would normally be recorded through multiple channels: escort team identification, vehicle assignment, destination confirmation. None of those records had appeared in the system logs he had accessed. Only the authorization itself existed. Mercer reached the brighter corridor again, the chandeliers casting warm light across the polished floor. He paused for a moment near the study door where the entire situation had begun. Somewhere inside the palace, Princess Charlotte had been moved through a restricted route by someone using the credentials of a senior security officer. The system treated the relocation as legitimate, but the physical evidence Mercer had just found, the abandoned tracking wristband and the unlogged vehicle presence, suggested that whatever had happened during those missing 3 minutes had been designed specifically to avoid attention from the rest of the security network.
Daniel Mercer returned to the main corridor with the same controlled pace expected of a royal protection officer, but the steady quiet of the palace now carried a different weight in his mind. The chandeliers above cast warm reflections across the polished floor, and the corridor cameras continued their silent watch as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet Mercer knew the chain of events unfolding within the palace security system did not align with normal protocol. The study room had been empty. The camera footage had lost 3 minutes without triggering an alert. A senior officer's authorization had appeared in the system during that exact gap, and in the service corridor, the princess's tracking wristband had been removed and left behind near an exit where a vehicle had clearly arrived. Mercer stopped briefly beside another security console positioned near the administrative wing junction. He activated the interface and opened the palace internal occupancy records. The system displayed a structured list of rooms across the surrounding sectors: conference suites, reception lounges, and administrative offices used by visiting officials or senior palace staff. Most entries showed the standard status: secured and unoccupied. Mercer scrolled slowly through the list until one line caught his attention. Private Lounge B. Access activated 14 minutes earlier. No scheduled reservation attached to the entry. Mercer leaned slightly closer to the screen. Private Lounge B was located deeper inside the palace residential wing, a quiet room typically reserved for short meetings with visiting diplomats or internal security briefings. It was rarely used without a scheduled record attached to the booking system. Mercer checked the timestamp again. The room had been accessed less than 2 minutes after the 3-minute gap in the corridor camera feed. Mercer closed the console interface and began walking down the side corridor leading toward the lounge area. The palace architecture changed subtly as he moved deeper into this wing. The lighting became softer, designed more for comfort than for staff activity. Thick carpets covered the floors, absorbing the sound of footsteps, and framed historical paintings lined the walls in evenly spaced intervals. The quiet here felt deeper than in the main hallways, almost insulated from the rest of the building. When Mercer reached the door marked Private Lounge B, he paused briefly. The digital access panel beside the door glowed blue, indicating the room had been secured after the last entry. That meant whoever had accessed the room earlier had locked it again from the outside. Mercer entered his identification code, and the lock disengaged with a soft mechanical click. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. The lounge was dimly lit by a floor lamp positioned near a pair of chairs beside a small glass table. Heavy curtains muted the last of the evening light filtering through the windows. At first glance, the room appeared empty. Then Mercer saw her. Princess Charlotte sat quietly on one of the chairs, her posture calm though slightly uncertain, her hands resting loosely in her lap as if she had been waiting for someone to return.
Mercer closed the door gently behind him, keeping his movements steady so as not to startle the child. Princess Charlotte looked up as he stepped further into the room, her expression relaxing slightly when she recognized the familiar red uniform of the palace guards. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," Mercer said quietly, maintaining the calm tone used during all royal interactions. "Are you comfortable here?" She nodded once, though her eyes drifted briefly toward the far side of the room, where another door stood partially open. Mercer followed her glance. Standing near that doorway was a man in a dark security uniform, his posture straight and composed. Senior Security Officer Adrian Halstead. The older officer stepped forward calmly as Mercer approached the center of the lounge. His expression showed no visible concern, only the steady professionalism expected from someone holding a high position within Royal Security Command. "Guard Mercer," Halstead said, his voice even, "you were not assigned to this sector." Mercer replied calmly. The princess was listed as still inside the study room. The room was empty. Halstead gave a small nod, as though acknowledging a minor administrative inconvenience. A precautionary relocation, a temporary measure. There was no reason to notify the corridor post. Mercer did not respond immediately. The explanation was delivered with confidence, yet it left several critical elements unanswered. The missing camera footage, the removed tracking wristband, the unlogged vehicle in the courtyard. Halstead studied Mercer for a moment, then continued speaking in a slightly firmer tone. "The relocation was conducted under my authority. You will record the event in the system as a controlled internal security drill." Mercer understood the meaning of the instruction immediately. Once logged as a drill, the missing minutes in the camera recording would be categorized as part of a test scenario. The service corridor exit would appear as a simulated relocation route. Every irregularity Mercer had discovered would disappear inside an official explanation approved by senior command. Mercer looked briefly toward Princess Charlotte again. She had begun quietly examining the small digital bracelet resting on the table beside her, the same wristband that had once tracked her location through the palace network. When Mercer turned back to Halstead, his expression remained professional, but the decision forming in his mind had already begun to solidify. Recording the incident as a routine exercise would protect the authority of the command structure, but it would also erase the fact that a royal child had been moved through an unmonitored corridor and placed into a vehicle route without proper notification to the palace protection network. And if Mercer refused the instruction, he would be openly challenging one of the highest-ranking officers inside Royal Security Command. Daniel Mercer remained standing in the quiet lounge, the soft hum of the palace ventilation system the only sound breaking the still air. The room felt insulated from the rest of the building, the thick carpet and heavy curtains absorbing every small movement. Across from him, Senior Security Officer Adrian Halstead stood with calm authority, his posture relaxed but deliberate, the kind of quiet control expected from someone accustomed to command. Princess Charlotte sat quietly beside the small glass table, her attention drifting between the two guards, as if she sensed the shift in tone without fully understanding its meaning. Mercer kept his voice respectful when he spoke again. "Sir, the princess's tracking band was removed in the service corridor." Halstead's expression did not change. "Temporary measure," he replied evenly, "part of the evaluation." Mercer continued carefully, choosing his words with the discipline of someone trained to operate within a strict hierarchy. "The corridor cameras lost 3 minutes of recording during the relocation." Halstead took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing slightly now. "Controlled interruption," he said. "The exercise required it." Mercer remained silent for a moment, the weight of the explanation settling between them. Royal protection drills did exist, but they followed precise notification procedures.
Guards stationed near the exercise area were normally informed at least moments before the scenario began to prevent unnecessary escalation. In this case, the corridor guard, Mercer himself, had been given no such notice. Halstead stepped closer to the table, his voice lowering slightly. "Guard Mercer, you have demonstrated initiative by tracing the relocation, but initiative does not replace command authority." Mercer nodded once, acknowledging the statement without arguing it. Halstead continued, the firmness in his tone leaving little room for interpretation. "The princess was never in danger. This movement was conducted under my authorization as part of an internal readiness review. The record will reflect that." He gestured lightly toward the door. "You will file the report accordingly and return to your assigned post." Mercer understood the structure of the order immediately. Once the event was logged as a readiness drill, the system would archive the missing camera minutes under controlled test parameters. The service corridor exit would become part of a simulated scenario. The unlogged vehicle movement would disappear inside the explanation of training logistics. Halstead watched him closely now, waiting for confirmation. Inside the Royal Protection Service, obedience to command was not simply expected, it was the structure that allowed the entire system to function. Yet Mercer also knew the protection protocol that stood above every other rule in the palace security handbook. Any movement involving a royal child required transparent documentation across the protection network. No single officer was meant to bypass that safeguard alone. Mercer looked briefly toward Princess Charlotte. She sat calmly, unaware that her quiet relocation through the palace had triggered a conflict inside the very system designed to protect her. When Mercer turned back to Halstead, his expression remained composed, but his decision had already formed. "Sir," Mercer said quietly, "Royal Child Protection procedures require relocation clearance to be registered with the Household Protection Desk." Halstead's patience faded slightly. "And that clearance came from me," his voice sharper now. Mercer nodded once more. Then he reached slowly for the secure communication unit clipped inside his jacket. Halstead's eyes hardened immediately. "Mercer!" The warning in the single word carried the weight of rank and authority. Mercer activated the encrypted channel without hesitation. The radio emitted a brief digital tone as the connection established with the palace communications center. Mercer spoke clearly and calmly into the device. "Royal Guard Daniel Mercer requesting direct contact with His Royal Highness Prince William regarding a royal child protection irregularity." The room fell completely silent. Halstead's expression darkened slightly as he realized what Mercer had just done. Several seconds passed before the radio crackled softly with the voice of the palace communications officer. "Stand by, Guard Mercer." The pause that followed felt longer than it was. Princess Charlotte glanced up briefly, sensing the tension in the room, though no one had raised their voice. Finally, the radio came alive again with a different voice, calm, direct, unmistakable. "Prince William." "This is William," the voice said evenly. "Report." Mercer spoke without hesitation. "Your Royal Highness, security logs indicate Princess Charlotte was relocated through a restricted service corridor using a command authorization that bypassed standard child protection procedures." A brief silence followed on the line. Then the prince asked one simple question. "Who issued the authorization?" Mercer met Halstead's gaze as he answered. "Senior Security Officer Adrian Halstead, sir." Another pause came across the channel, shorter this time. When Prince William spoke again, his voice remained calm, but carried the firm certainty of command. "Hold your position, Guard Mercer." The words were precise and controlled. Officer Halstead is to be detained immediately. A final sentence followed without hesitation. Palace Security Command will proceed with arrest.